Stephen, thank you very much indeed for that, and I think that will have inevitably have prompted a number of points and questions that people want to raise. I wonder whether I might start off with one, in that I think that the Non-Executive Director Awards have been a terrific achievement. It strikes me that the impact of them has grown as the years have gone on, but probably in the last few years they seem as if they've got more profile, more talked about them, more comment and whatever. Now, I've had this conversation with Sir Roger Carr, I've also had a conversation with Sir John Parker as well, and I still haven't totally got a satisfactory answer, so I thought you're bound to be able to have the answer for this one. With this wealth of information you've clearly built up, the processes that you're going through, it surprises me that what has not started to come out, I hope this may not be too far away, is a little bit more of the analysis as to what it is that are being looked at, the criteria that are being applied, because I think that could be quite a contribution to governance generally on boards. It's all rather qualitative, we don't really see a great deal coming out. I just wonder whether there's a little trick being missed there.
Okay, good question, and asking me to follow in the footsteps of Sir John Parker and Sir Roger Carr is going to be quite tough. But I have to say, when I sit on that judging panel and I look at the recommendations that are screened initially by representatives from the Henley Business School and the Cranfield School of Business, we then put forward a short list of 5, where the sponsors for each category then interview each particular shortlisted candidate and then present them to our judging panel. I can't say anything other than it should be subjective and qualitative, because I don't believe there is a scientific methodology to say that this is what a non-executive director should look like. Because no two boardrooms are the same, and no two company structures are the same, and no two companies operating in the economy really are the same. They're all different. The people are different, the personalities are different, the cultures are different, the environments are different. So I'm sorry, I'm going to have to agree with them and say no.
It's safe grounds, good company that you've chosen there, Steve. Anyway, you can see why the question is, sort of floats out as one that's been bugging me for a little while. So who wants to carry on with any particular points? And lady over there, yeah.
Yeah, I've noticed the comments earlier on about the regulatory environment that
Can you hear clearly over there? Yes? No, I think we might. Do you mind if we have a microphone, madam? Sorry.
Not sure I can shout. I work in remuneration, where the rules have changed quite dramatically. You mentioned PRA. Now I've noticed that we are doing more and more work trying to educate the non-executives that we work with in how to find solutions to the rules. And I think you've all seen recently that the European Banking Authority are now declaring certain actions that banking groups have taken as illegal. So we have this ongoing struggle where the banks and the vested interests are trying to maximise the rules and the regulators are trying to control something. Do you not believe that would you see a role for non-executives in actually trying to take the honest broker line here and go back to regulators and say you're missing the point, you're managing the wrong piece of
it's a very good point, and I think the power right now, particularly in financial services, is very much with the regulator, and the public opinion is still very anti those that participate in the world of financial services. I can point to many areas of financial services that contributed to the financial crisis. I can also point to probably more areas of financial services that didn't. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people that do very valuable work extraordinarily hard, long hours, etc., but cannot even think of pleading mercy or poverty for fear that anything they earn above the minimum wage or the living wage would be a travesty of justice. So I think the remuneration committees have got a very difficult job right now. The industry itself is trying to digest regulatory change, particularly when it comes to remuneration and compensation, and the only solution they have is to increase fixed costs. It's got to be a disastrous response to any environment. All that does is you get a lot of very highly paid individuals on a basic salary, which means they come into work in the morning, don't have to do very much, to justify their existence, and at the end of the year, if people have got no bonus, it doesn't matter. But all that does is paint a target on their backs for when the next wave of change happens. We're going to see wholesale change in financial services over the next 3-6 months. Waves of redundancies, I think, come as the industry adapts to what is the single largest concentration of regulatory change in an 18-month period for about 30 years. And it's not just on remuneration. It's MiFID II, it's CSDR, it's best execution, it's payment for order flow, it's market use regime, it's fair and efficient markets regime, it's MiFIR. You name it, it goes on and on and on. You can put any three letters together and you'll probably find a regulatory acronym for some changes heading our way. So yeah, I think there is obviously work to be done. But at some point in time the pendulum will start to swing back and the industry itself will gain its teeth and have the ability to stand up to that change. I don't think we're there yet.
I suppose my question is that something non-executives should be leading and driving more?
You can hear. Greg, can you hear? Yes? Just show if you can't, please.
One of the phrases that I'm a great believer in, and I coined this for a MiFID II survey that I did, was the law of unintended consequence. And sometimes I think, with the greatest of respect, regulators and politicians take a relatively simplistic view of what is actually a wholly complicated industry. When I talk about MiFID II research on CSDR and settlements, it's almost like every stock is Vodafone and BP. It isn't. You can't buy and sell stocks that easily. And with remuneration, it's the same thing. People need to want to get employed, they need to earn money, they need to justify their existence, they need to support their families. And I think there does come a stage where you have to fight back, or you have to argue back, or you have to, I'm probably saying not a very good way, you have to make your case in the right manner. Turning around to a regulator saying you're wrong, you've got it all wrong, you don't know what you're talking about, the wall goes up and you'll get nowhere. Are you really sure this is what you intended? Because this is one of the potential consequences of what you're looking to do. You may get up, actually I haven't quite realised that, but do you mind coming in and educating me a bit more on what exactly you mean? That's a far better approach, and that's something that we've seen has worked. But I think when it comes to remuneration, we're not there yet.
You will be there when you've read the write-up in Board Talk about evasion and But thank you for that. Right, where else are we going? Who wants to make a point and an observation?
Yeah.
So,
Stephen, thank you for all your views. Really some question. What's a non-exec going to look like in the year 2020? I'm a bit grayer.
I had it to go grey, I'll be quite clear. That's a very good question. I think there's been a huge amount of academic work done on governance and stewardship and oversight, and trying to gaze into a crystal ball of what a non-exec would look like. All I can say is it would look very different to how it is now. I think the regulatory burden is without question going to take its toll. I think the personal liability issue, will it stretch to non-execs? How much will it capture their involvement? Difficult to tell. But all I can say is more responsibility, more liability, without question. I wish I could say more than that. Apologies if that's a bit of a weak or limp answer, but the pace of regulatory change, I think, is quite frightening right now, and the ability for a non-exec to adapt to that is quite challenging.
where are we going to go? Louis.
I just want to follow up on your question, actually. So I think that's the key thing also is it should be a younger person coming to the role. I don't think, in the past it was I'm retiring, I'm going to take on an energy portfolio. You do need to start at a younger age. I think the business model across the board is changing. You need to be more aware of the dynamics, particularly technology, and the speed of change. So I think that's going to be quite a big step. I think there's going to be a younger profile for non-executive directors.
Better get that appointment soon.
Do you think, and look around this room before you answer it, do you think we're going to be able to meet the challenge of diversity on our PLC?
We've got one French lady, I noticed, anyway, so that's a start.
Double diversity.
Double diversity. I disagree with the idea of mandatory diversity. I think it has to be the right person for the right role. And that's something that can only be done by encouraging diversity to grow and encouraging those that aren't represented currently to participate and throw their hat into the ring to be chosen or for consideration. So I would say, will we meet the targets? Doubt it. Same with carbon emissions, same sort of thing. Put it off, put it off. That's a problem. That'll get me caught in the papers and probably fired. No, it's one of those things that I think everyone would like to have, but I think if you make it mandatory, you could be storing up a bit of trouble. Having said that, I also believe there are a large number of, and I'm also going to be careful what I say.
Give us some good headlines here, Tom. You're listening.
I do believe there are a large number of individuals that probably aren't as appropriate for the roles that they perform still in place. And that's something that does need to change. And I think, as the chap over there mentioned, a generation coming through better aware of regulatory change, technology, cyber, you name it, will start to displace those that aren't quite so appropriate. And as the cycles of board tenure revolve, you'll see more displaced, which I think will encourage a better potential for diversity to reach its targets.
My wife has a longer and more glamorous and glittering non-executive career than mine, and in government boards as well as bigger PLCs. She has a crack which she makes in circumstances like this, and as she isn't here, I'll do it for her. She always says that she believes in positive discrimination for women because it works so well for men.
Yeah. Yep. It's very good.
Sir. Right, another man here.
Yeah, might as well. Stephen, tempting as it is to go down the financial services route, I'm going to avoid that and dip into your sweet spot of the small to mid-cap. The question is, how are investor attitudes towards NEDs changing, and what should we as NEDs do in response?
That's a very good question. Investors rarely get the opportunity to meet or talk to non-execs of small and mid-sized company boards. Normally their touch point is the chief exec or the FD, and if they are large enough to have an IR, then maybe from time to time the chair, particularly if they are an executive chair. It doesn't quite count. So I would say that if I would say speak up, stand out, ask to meet investors. Demand of your board the opportunity to sit in front of investors and hear what they have to say. There is nothing in the rule book that I'm aware of that stops that. So it almost becomes a function of, well, I'm not exec, I only sort of turn up for the occasional, I do my board, the board, the risk committee, the audit committee, nomination committee, and I sit and talk to the executives and the committee members at the time. But actually, I'd like to meet some of the investors and hear what they have to say. That will help me do my job more effectively. So I would say ask.
Because I think, in spite of all the increased transparency, apart from remuneration, I haven't seen it produce a more interactive dialogue with investors.
I think you're right. I can't disagree.
I mean, if I could just comment as an institutional investor, the answer is get the institutions to go to the annual general meeting. They never do. We go because we want to meet all the non-execs. We want to understand the dynamics on the board, whether NED are strong or not strong, who really is running the board. The institutions just don't go there.
Yeah.
And it's sad, because that's how you get, and I tell you, when a non-exec doesn't come to an AGM, and we're there, we say, where the hell is he? I'm sorry, he's in the headmaster's study, with me, afterwards.
Be more demanding. Right, where are we going next? I saw someone in my peripheral vision. Sir.
A view, if you would please, on...
and you can still hear, tell me if you can't.
Active shareholders. Are they a force for good in terms of pro bono counsel, or are they best seen as a threat to the future?
I take a very pragmatic approach to that question. Pro bono counsel is a very nice way. I'm not sure there's many companies that consider them to be pro bono counsel. They consider them a pain in a certain part of the anatomy. But actually, there is nothing stopping any organisation buying a significant portion of the company shares and demanding a seat on the board or representation. And whether you're doing it for good or because you're activists just to make a quick buck, or maybe you're doing it as an activist to generate change for good. You know, I think it's a risk that exists for all companies. But if they have the right board structure and the right governance and the right shareholder register, where many companies don't, so it's very easy for a lot of people to accumulate significant stakes, then they should at least have some semblance of defence. And if their business practices are good and they're doing their job properly, why would an activist take any interest? Maybe that's too pragmatic.
Very pragmatic. Right, where are we going next? This gentleman here, please.
In a sense, part of the skill set of an NED is the generalist, outsider perspective, governance and so on. Yet you refer to a world where more specialisation and technical knowledge is needed, be it MiFID II, and I had the misfortune to read the last weekend from cover to cover, be it MiFID II, be it technology you've referred to and so on. How do you balance the generic general skills and common sense of an NED versus the demands of a more and more technical world?
If it hadn't have been blowing a gale, you probably would have been on the golf course and not read it, but last weekend. Good question. All I'm saying here is that the responsibility of the non-exec is not staying static, it's certainly not decreasing, it's increasing. Therefore, and it's funny because academically, you know, there should be a cycle or transition of boards over a period of years. But what that means is someone comes on the board, doesn't know much about it, after a couple of years or 4 years or 5 years they know everything about it, and then should they be replaced? That also is an interesting paradox in itself. But I do think there are some simple things: social media, technology, cybercrime, you know, regulation. You don't have to be an expert in the specific area that the company operates in to have a view and to be able to comment effectively and to challenge effectively in those areas. They're quite general topics, but can be extraordinarily specific to particular companies and the areas they operate. So I'm saying, generally, there's a greater level of awareness that needs to fall on the shoulders of the non-exec to allow them to be as effective as they should be in this changing world.
NEDs are known for their constructive challenge. I think I'd like to come back with one, if you don't mind.
Please.
I think I found that on any new NED job, I've got a learning curve.
Yep.
And if it's in a sector I don't know, it's double the learning curve. And I don't feel I can do my job as an NED until I've understood the sector I'm working in.
Yep.
So it's that generalist that we talked about has got a job to do in becoming more than just a generalist on the board asking the daft laddie question.
I think you misunderstood me. What I was saying is there's a level of, there's a generation aspect to this, so I'm not saying this in any disrespectful way, but you know, there are things that my kids know about technology and systems and infrastructure that I'm not. I like to think I'm reasonably aware of some of these things, but I'm just not. You know, we had an incident ourselves where misuse of firm software led to some gross misconduct charges on our own employees. And these are people that should know better. So what I'm saying is there's a level of awareness that I think any non-exec needs to have about some of these areas. And absolutely, you take on a board role, you want to know, you don't want to be the numpty in the corner asking the stupid questions. You want to be able to effectively challenge the board, stand up for what you think is right, and provide that stewardship and oversight and governance and function. So I'm not generalising it at all. I'm saying there are certain topics that, you know, whether it's through generation or through past experience you're not aware of, there's a general learning curve to get up.
Sir?
Yeah, you just wonder, in some of the big corporate scandals that have happened in recent years, things like BP, Thomas Cook with the gas and the petroleum, we have totally inappropriate reactions by the companies, particularly the chairman, CEOs, etc. Where were the NEDs in all this?
You got the question over that side? Yes? Good. Let me know if you're not hearing, please. Stephen, that's a great question. Come on.
It is a great question. And I think one of the things we're trying to do here is, with these awards, is single out those people who have done a good job, who have stood up, who have argued and agitated for change, who have had the courage to remove a chief exec or remove the chief financial officer, or make the changes that are necessary, or block a strategic move that a company might wish to take. So you can't vouch for everything, and you're absolutely right. So I think there's been a huge amount of bad judgment and decision making by boards. I think it's happened throughout history. I think it's happening. I even mentioned today, the billionaire Brazilian in charge of BTG Pactual, which is a multi-billion dollar company, he's got a controlling interest, arrested. Tesco's we've had, Rolls-Royce we've had. So some of the bullish chip names in the UK market are also tempted.
I guess the difference now is because of social media and the quick transmittal of news, it's much more in the public eye than would have been done previously.
Yes, it is. That also puts into question the sort of crisis management that boards have. And I'm not sure that that's entirely appropriate in many cases, because there's, oh Christ, what do we do now? Hunker down, best say nothing, which can be worse. Maybe that's a role that PR companies can start to take, to actually advise their boards on how they should deal with crises. Should they materialise? There should be some case studies done. How did the board respond in BP? How did it respond in Thomas Cook? How did it respond in Rolls-Royce? Perhaps that can be exercises that PR companies can help their boards on, or boards can undertake themselves.
I think boards often turn to the NED when there is a crisis, because they can provide an independent perspective and often can bring an experience of perhaps other companies they've worked in to help them through that process, but it probably isn't reported because it goes on behind the scenes.
I agree, but also I think one of the issues is there is a timing aspect. So something happens and it's alerted to the world immediately, and you get that immediate emotional reaction from the general public. Normally what a board would do is say, something's happened here, let's understand what's happened, let's try and find the root causes, let's look at any impact analysis of ramifications that may come, and undertake a strategic review, which obviously takes a number of days or potentially even weeks. At that point, the hysteria is still there and there's no response from the company, so therefore that time lag is a very, very difficult one to manage. So the entities may be doing the right thing and saying, we've got to do this, we've got to do that, and it may take a period of time, at which point they are seen to be lazy and ineffective.
Jason, I'm going to come back to you in a moment. Ladies first.
Well, I'm just going to make a comment that the problem with social media is that facts don't matter. It doesn't matter what the story is that gets out there.
Yeah.
The first story that gets out there is a story that gets out there and has to be dealt with, as opposed to what's really going on. Because whatever about your BBCs and Sky News may be slightly more interested in the truth, Twitter and Facebook don't give a damn. What they hear, they copy, they send, and suddenly you're fighting and swinging against a number of them.
Jason, I'm going to come to you, and then I'm going to come back to Josephine. Yeah.
Stephen, not from my firm, of course, but I've seen examples of sort of what I call lazy recruitment in the non-executive director space as far as selection exercises, where perhaps a serial non-executive director has won the role over, something like three to it in the first role. So any thoughts on winning your first NED role and stepping stones to doing so?
Another good question. There's a sort of safety and a comfort in experience, which I totally agree is a lazy response. And it's actually having the courage to put your best foot forward and take a chance on somebody that you believe might do the job better. In a way, it's almost a bit embarrassing, because actually there's not just one non-executive board, so actually taking a chance on somebody, you've still got plenty of balance. So why companies don't do that, I don't know. It's a question. One of our co-sponsors in this is Hydra Constructors, and they obviously run a very major FTSE 100 board practice. And it's a question I can ask them to see if they've noticed any change in the way boards are approaching hiring. I suppose very experienced, but not in the NED world, versus very experienced serial NEDs.
Audex could measure it, couldn't you, Ray? You could measure it all. Sorry, no, Josephine, I think I was going to go to the next pick.
What would be your exemplars of best practice and in terms of disaster recovery and so on? Bearing in mind that one doesn't often get this when one sees, for example, the Prime Minister cheering the decease of Jihadi John on television, and perhaps we should be more circumspect because the Russian plane was down a few days later. So what would be, you mentioned that PR could have a role in this, and bearing in mind that the Prime Minister is an ex-PR chap, what would be your exemplars of best practice?
It's a difficult one, not least of which mixing up non-execs with jihadis, but I'll sort of,
the social media effect.
I know what you're saying.
So on, yes.
I mean, if I look at my own business and I have to have an ICAP for my capital, an ILA for my liquidity, a business contingency plan, a contingency funding plan, an enterprise-wide risk management framework, a risk appetite statement, the list goes on and on and on. And all of these are mandated and requirements from the regulator that is not going to let up on the way they look at what you're doing. So there is a threshold of best practice that we have to try and live up to. And unfortunately that threshold, the barrier gets raised every time a regulator sees another company that's done something different and they like that. Well, why haven't you? Why haven't you? Why haven't you? So the exemplars, I think, are a difficult one because the barriers I think are being raised all the time. But peer group analysis and using your PR agency to try and understand where you fit into that spectrum, together with your own regular review of your governance mechanism, I think are a very good starting point.
John, then I'm going to take one more question.
Yeah,
So, John. Right.
I was just thinking around boards, with some boards, with some NEDs certainly possibly being very effective or worse, disruptive to a board as well. Do you think there's quite a case to be more scientific around the way you recruit your NEDs, whether that be through psychometrics, through thinking styles, and those types of things, to make sure they're much more holistic approach to the way they're recruited?
Yeah, that's also a tough one. I mean, interviewing, people are very good at interviews and they're hopeless as employees. And if they're there full time, you tend to find that out much faster than with an NED that you see once every month or quarter or 6 months. So that's a tough one. Psychometric testing for a non-exec is a difficult one. I think it's references and background and what have they done and how and why and what are we looking for, and is that the right person, and a zero tolerance and compromise on people in terms of who you hire has got to be the best starting point. And everybody makes mistakes, and you can take the best person that you believe is appropriate for the role and they can become exposed quite quickly, or you can have someone that you thought was a bit of a shrinking violet and suddenly turn around and be that person you were looking for.
Are you that person I'm looking for, sir?
Stephen, this is a question on getting the first role. There's lots of contradictory advice about how one should do it. And I heard from a recruiter last week that one shouldn't apply for a role with a company in the sector that your experience is in, but you should apply for one which is adjacent to. But you couldn't define what adjacent to meant. I just wondered whether you subscribe to the same view, not the sector that you're
Well, it goes back to the gentleman's point over here, that there's a safety and a comfort in something that you know, where someone's got experience in your industry that you believe they can bring to bear in your own company, as opposed to those that want to take a chance. And because, I don't know, if a company is in its comfort field, or comfort zone rather, then they will probably look for somebody that's got the complementary skills. If the company's in a bit of trouble, they may look for that fresh face that can help them. That's again a very generalist statement, and it might not be correct. It's a bit of a generalisation, but I would say adjacent to is not a bad approach, because you understand your industry. It does overlap to a certain degree with what you've done, but you're kind of intrigued as to why they're doing it this way, because you like to challenge what you're doing, how you're doing it, why, etc., etc. So I wouldn't necessarily disagree.
Good. Well, on that note of not necessarily disagreeing, and I know there are one or two other questions. Stephen's going to be around for a little while, so do take the opportunity to buttonhole him. And at this point, we're now going to turn to Charles Russon, who's just going to propose a vote of thanks. Charles.